Y'all, our next guest, Cliff, come up, and I'll have to say, he threw the corn down there on the ground where the chickens can get it. Brother Mike Gaddy, he's going to put the hay on the ground where the goats can get to it. So if we'll just sit here and listen and soak it up, we're going to learn something else, and we're well on our way to learning something to take here and leave here today, and we'll know how to best use it. Mike Gaddy, former VP of the American Foundation for Accountability of Prisoners and Missing in Action, 1987 through 90. In addition to having heroes like Mike Gaddy, we got Brother Spade right here by Herman, a real hero, Jim Tucker. You two fellas stand up. Mike Gaddy, stand up if you would. Spade, Brother Jim. If you want to know what's going on in the military, these boys can tell you. Thank both of you. Mike is a former field leader of the Minutemen Project from Arizona in 2005. He's a teacher of the founding ERA of America and our Second War of Independence in multiple states for over 20 years. He currently has 2 radio programs on Republic Broadcasting, the Rebel and the Renegade Roundtable. Ed and I participated on his show last Sunday, and he's from over in Perry, Georgia. The next day, we had a gentleman, he'll be here tomorrow, sign up for the conference that heard us on the radio program. And then day before yesterday, we had some boys from Clanton, working young men, that's going to join us tomorrow from the radio program. So you need to listen. Not only does he have a good message, it's a good way to get your message out. A lot of good information there. And he's going to share how to best to get to that information. But let's give Mike Gaddy a big hand, and many thanks for letting us be on the show, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. It's certainly indeed a pleasure. Trying to stand up here on these old legs with my arthritis. I'll do the very best I can. And I just wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to be here. And I appreciate that. And to give you a little bit of my background, I was born in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, about a good rock's throw from Tennessee. Some of you may have heard of a place there. Some people ask me where I was from. When I say Flag Pond, they go, never heard of that. Well, it's about this big. So, and I thank the gentleman who preceded me for what he said about people in uniform, because I love people in uniform. I was a person in uniform. But I'm damn tired of the way the government treats us and the things that it has done. And that just really bothers me so very, very much, because I asked the question, why are we sending money to the Ukraine and we've got 100,000 homeless veterans? Why? We take care of our own first before we get involved in other things. Well, I was reared by my grandfather, who fortunately adopted me, he and my grandmother, when I was 5, 6 years old. My dad had been killed in Korea. Now, I would have much rather had my dad alive than off fighting somewhere based on lies that our government tells. So when I give my presentations, just like the gentleman who preceded me, don't think I don't love the people in uniform. I do. I just would not recommend anybody go there now, because on my drive over here, I drove past the place where I had basic training and jump school in the U.S. Army. It was called Fort Benning, and it's still Fort Benning. And it made me angry as I was driving by, because believe it or not, this is the first time I've even driven through there, because they've got the big interstate signs up now, Fort Moore. For more what? More socialism. And that is what, there are people today who will tell you, oh, we've got so many names for this war. The war between the states, the war of northern aggression, our second war for independence, which I love that one, Stonewall's creation. But I've got my own name for the war. And it's the war where the good people of the South tried to stop the spread of socialism in America. And we're still trying. We're still trying. We're still doing the absolute best that we can. And I have become a student of history. I didn't put it on my resume because I'm not proud of it, but I was once an agent for the National Security Agency. Oh, it got real quiet then. But I had been with them for some time, and I felt like what we were doing was proper. And then along about 1980, I began to see that according to the American government, more and more and more, they considered their enemy to be the people of this country. And we started making PSYOPs. Maybe you've never heard of a PSYOP, psychological operation, to how you affect people's thinking, to get them to think the way you want to. And so we started working on PSYOPs on the American public. And I finally got to the point, walked into my boss, and I said, I can't do this. He said, what do you mean? I said, the American people are not my enemy. That's not what I'm here for. And he said, well, you ever been traveling down the highway in the back seat of a car at 75 miles an hour? And I said, yes, sir, I have. And he said, did you have any say-so where the car went? And I said, no, sir. And he said, well, you have no say-so here. Just do your job. 2 hours later, they had my resignation. Ironically, the good Lord works in mysterious ways. We all know that. Ironically, a day or so later, I get a phone call from General John Singlaub. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He was big in military intelligence, which is an oxymoron. But he said, and I had briefed him on multiple occasions with NSA. And he said, Mike, I heard you left the No Such Agency. And I said, yes, sir, that's correct. He said, would you come to work for me? And I said, what are you doing, General? And he said, well, I'm starting an organization called the American Foundation for the Accountability of Prisoners of War and Missing in Action. He said, I'm damn tired of seeing how our veterans are being treated, the ones who are left behind in the hands of their enemy, and then our government lies about it and covers it up. And he said, I want you to do several things. I want you to do research for me. You know the people at the National Archives and Library of Congress because you've been there for NSA. And he said, I want you to do research, and then I would like for you to travel around the country giving presentations for me. And I said, well, General, twist my arm. And I spent 4 years with the American Foundation for Accountability of Prisoners of War Missing in Action. And you're going to get mad at me here because I hate politicians. I don't care what color they come in, red or blue. I don't have very much respect for any of them because, number one, if you're going to be successful in politics, you have to be a world-class liar. Because you're not going to get it any other way. And my life experiences have taught me that. And so, and I did a program recently on one of my radio shows called In the Belly of the Beast. And I tried to explain what it was like actually seeing what this government is doing and what it intends to do. But the fortune of being with the American Foundation for Accountability of Prisoners of War and Missing in Action, I got to meet so many men that I just had so much respect for. Many of them were returned veterans from Vietnam. I got to meet them. I got to speak with them on multiple occasions. And I do not like golf. I call it cow pasture pool. But I had the advantage of driving the golf cart for the man, Colonel, having one of those senior moments. I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, I spent time with him, and he told me, I never forget, going to the back seat of his Oldsmobile 88 down in Tucson in 1986, 87. Went to the back seat and he said, I want to show you something. And I said, okay, Colonel, thank you. Laird Gutterson. I knew it would come back here. Old brain works sometime. And Colonel Gutterson, he had been the SRO, the senior ranking officer at the Hanoi Hilton. And he told me a story, and I'm going to share it with you because I promise you, you've never heard it. He said when they got back, they had that champagne and chocolate-covered strawberry celebration at the White House for the men who returned. And Colonel Gutterson told me, he said, the day before we left, I saw at least 60 or 70 POWs that weren't on that plane with us. They're still there. And this country's lying and covering it up. And then he told me something, again, that really made me dislike politicians, was he said, and here, let me show you a picture. And he brought up a picture out of his trunk, and he showed me this picture. He said, you know who those two gentlemen are? And I said, I know one of them. He said, who is it? And I said, John McCain. He said, who's the other one? I said, I don't have a clue. Colonel, who is it? And he said, that is Colonel Bui Tin of the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. He said, I know of at least 5 men he tortured to death. Why is John McCain hugging him in this picture? He said, several of us, myself, Colonel Ted Guy, Major John Parcells. He said, we went to the President and Henry Kissinger and said, we want to prefer charges against John McCain. He was treasonous. He even made radio programs for the North Vietnamese while he was there. The Vietnamese called him the prince. They brought him women. And so when he got back to America, what did he do? Well, he divorced his wife because she was now crippled. She had been one of the biggest advocates for the POWs. She was crippled because she'd been in a car wreck, but she didn't want him to know about it while he was captive. He got back to the United States, and within several months, he divorced his wife.
It's a true statement. He was my skipper.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad you're probably familiar with his mess called the Forrestal, right? Okay. I won't go into that in any great detail. But anyway, I got to know these people, and these people meant a lot to me. But going back to my grandfather, now I'm going to use a word of profanity here, and I ask for your indulgence before I do. My grandfather, during the entire life, he lived to be 100 years old. He lived with me his last 8 years, and I took him to places he had never seen before in his life. I'll share with you one brief story about him with when I took him to the Grand Canyon. Took him to the Grand Canyon, and we walked up. He stood there, turned around, started to walk away, and I said, well, what do you think, Pa? He said, hell of a ditch. So I learned more from him, and I'll tell you a little bit about my grandfather. My grandfather's father was a captain in the 37th North Carolina Infantry Regiment. His mother's brother was a member of the Black Mountain Boys from Yancey County. I can't remember their numerical designation. But he grew up at their feet, listening to their stories. And he related so many of them to me over the years. But he was a true Confederate because of his upbringing. And Thank you. And he said something to me one day I want all of you to think about. Take it into your hearts. He said, boy, you know, I didn't even know he knew my name till I was 30 years old. He said, boy, you can't be just a little bit Southern Confederate. You either is or you ain't. Now, which one is it? And folks, we can't be just a little bit Southern. We can't. We have to be totally devoted. I did not recognize the level of my grandfather's commitment until I was in the 5th grade. I told Mike this story. He said, you might want to tell the folks this, so I'm going to, so pardon my grandfather did not use profanity. And if he said something that was profane, everybody goes, because he's angry about something. So, very angry. And he would never use any word of profanity in the presence of a lady. Never. And he was very adamant about that. But we were at the 5th grade. It was parent-teacher meeting, and we were standing outside the door. There was a line that would go to the teacher. Then a parent or parents would go in with their child so that they could have privacy. And so we get up to the door. It's our turn to go in, and suddenly my grandfather grabs me by the arm, and he says, come on, boy. And I'm like, what? You know, I'm 9, 10 years old. What's going on here? Come on, get out of here. Okay. Well, the teacher comes to the door. Mr. Gaddy, you okay? Yes. And out we go. We get to the truck, and I said, Pa, what just happened? I don't understand. And he said, boy, I ain't going in no room with a picture of that son of a bitch on the wall. And the problem was, I didn't know what he was talking about. So the next day I go back to the classroom, walk in the door, and there's a picture of Honest Abe. And he wasn't even going in a room where he was. So, but then in my studies, I became really fond of history. I have to put that on my grandfather. I became especially when I found out that the majority of history we're taught is a lie. So I said, well, I'm going to do everything I can to find the truth. Now, some of the truth I'm going to share with you, you might not like it. I don't care. It's still the truth. And God didn't say, I am the way, a rumor, falsehood. He didn't say that. But one of the things I have really enjoyed in my ability to be at the National Archives, Library of Congress was the fact that that is where I've learned how much of a lie everything I had been taught was most of my life, especially about the South. Now, how many of you people are aware that the Revolutionary War wasn't won by George Washington and his troops up north? The Revolutionary War was won by Southerners, just like the ones who went off to battle in 1861 through 65. And how much money did the Yankee government give them while they were fighting these wars? Zero. And they had leaders like John Sevier, Thomas Sumter, Francis Marion. These people defeated the British. Where was the final battle? Yorktown? That's not in New York, is it? Is it in Massachusetts? No. And how many people are aware that George Washington hadn't led his troops in any major encounter for over a year and a half before the Battle of Yorktown? He had hit some supply lines, but he had not had one battle. And if you get right down to it, militarily speaking, George Washington was a mediocre commander at best. It's the reason a fellow named Aaron Burr left him. You can look it up. The last battle he fought in was the Battle of Monmouth, Monmouth. Monmouth Courthouse was their last major battle. But then I got very intrigued with a man that most of his peers quoted him as being the most devout Christian among the founders. Now, it wasn't Washington, wasn't James Madison, wasn't Alexander Hamilton, it was Patrick Henry. And most people, we aren't taught the truth about Patrick Henry today in a lot of ways. Patrick Henry was a devout Christian. How many people do you know that the first thing listed on their will is, I leave to my children the Christian faith, because without it, anything else I leave is worthless? And how many people led their doctors to Christ on their deathbed? That's Patrick Henry. But then Patrick Henry is, one of the things I will always remember is, we aren't taught, but the man who started the Revolutionary War was Patrick Henry, with his presentations at the House of Burgesses in Virginia, where he showed up in homespun clothes and wasn't wearing a wig and wasn't in a fancy horse carriage, and they made him produce his credentials for even being there. And then they talked about the Stamp Act of 1765 and how all of the colonists were going to be taxed by Britain to pay for the French and Indian War. Patrick Henry spoke against it at the Virginia House of Burgesses. Several of the Heidi people with their wigs on and everything else started yelling, treason, treason, treason. Because they had said, no, he said, I'm not paying those taxes. I'm not going to be involved in that. Happened to be the day after his 28th birthday. He said, I'm not going to do that. So he wrote up 5 provisions. 4 of them passed. And somehow all of those provisions got up north to a fellow by the name of Samuel Adams. Maybe you've had one of his beers. So he really then, he gets together with what's called the Loyal Nine, and then they became the Sons of Anarchy, whatever, not Anarchy, that was a movie. Sons of Liberty, thank you. First day with my new lips, I'm sorry. But anyway, then we know of Patrick Henry's, probably the only thing, I've asked several students in my community, high school students, what do you know about Patrick Henry? Give me liberty or give me death. That's all we know. At least most people. But when did he say that? He said that at St. John's Church, Virginia Congress, 1775. Now, how many people know that there were other people at that meeting there? There was George Washington, there was Thomas Jefferson, there was several other people who were there, James Madison. And most of those people spoke about why they needed to stay with the crown. Now listen to what Patrick Henry said. And this is what I tell everyone every time I speak, because I know that sometime before it's over, if I haven't made somebody mad when I finish here, I hadn't done my job. Because the truth makes people angry. But Patrick Henry said, and I quote, "Should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country and an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings." Unquote. What a way to start a presentation, huh? He knew how to do it. And I know there's probably a lot of people here today who think our Constitution is some kind of great document. It's not. It was written by Yankee lawyers, for Yankee lawyers, to interpret by Yankee lawyers. How many of you have ever heard of the Committee of Style and Arrangement. I thought you had, Mark. The Committee of Style and Arrangement was Yankee lawyers who revised the Constitution after the Committee of the Whole had published it. They completely changed the preamble, which made Patrick Henry very angry. And let's not forget, second to George Washington, the person who had the most votes to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention was Patrick Henry. And he refused to go. Why did he refuse to go? He said, because I smell a rat leaning toward a monarchy in Philadelphia. And he was exactly right. But folks, I'd like to ask you this on the part of give me liberty or give me death. Was not that exactly what 1 million Southern men said from 1861 to 1865? But they said it with actions and not words. Did they not say, give me liberty or give me death? Now, I don't know how anyone could sell that kind of sacrifice down the road. Thank you. Now, a couple of other quotes from Patrick Henry and why he didn't like this government under the Constitution. He said, my great objection to this government is that it does not leave us the means of defending our rights, nor does it give us the means of waging war against tyrants. Now, what in your Constitution protects you from a crooked politician? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And then he hits another one that I think is just spot on. And he saw it coming. We didn't. Most of the other people, at that time. He said, this government subjects everything to the northern majority. Is there not then a settled purpose to check the southern interest? We thus put unbounded power over our own property in the hands not having a common interest with us. How can the southern members prevent the adoption of the most oppressive mode of taxation on the southern states, as there is a majority in favor of the northern states? Sir, this is a picture so horrid, so wretched, so dreadful, that I need no longer dwell upon it. Unquote. Isn't that exactly what happened 70 years later? Didn't Patrick Henry predict it? Well, while living in retirement with his family as a planner and a practicing lawyer, the pamphlet containing the Constitution and the additional amendments adopted by the majority of the states requisite to make them part of the instrument was brought to Patrick Henry and examined by him most carefully in the presence of his son and Mr. Dandridge. Patrick was suspicious of the character of some of the framers of the Constitution. We all should be. And of the crafty politician through whose hands it had passed since its adoption by Virginia, and that he feared that they had not only altered the amendments adopted by the Virginia Convention, but had tampered with the body of the instrument itself. Now I'm going to give you an example of that. How many of you knew that in 1787, 12 of 13 colonies had in their state constitutions, you could not serve in government without taking an oath to the Christian faith? How many knew that? Anybody ever teach you? They teach you that down at school? Okay, well, Benjamin Franklin was given 2 pieces of paper to read when he got there. Now, we've all heard of Benjamin Franklin, right? How many of you know he had no business at the convention because he wasn't selected by any state? Why was he there? But anyway, he was supposed to read a letter from the Quakers asking to take slavery out of the Constitution, to not allow slavery to be put into the Constitution. He didn't read that. But what did he read? Oh, he read a letter from Jonas Phillips. You familiar with Jonas, Mark? Jonas Phillips was the head of the synagogue of Philadelphia. And Benjamin Franklin read his letter in which he implored the men at the convention to do away with all of the oaths to the Christian faith in any of the states and in the federal Constitution, because if they kept them, Jews could not serve in office. That's what he said. And so then they adopt Article 6, Clause 3. And people today think that's a good thing when it says that there can be no oath to any faith. I just don't know how you think that's going to work. It hasn't worked. At least. Yeah, big time. Well, Patrick Henry said after reading that and the amendments, he said, "I find that these shrewd northern statesmen have again outwitted our southern men in the wording of these amendments. They determined when this Constitution was framed to make this a great consolidated national government of all of the people of the states. To secure this object, they inserted in its preamble the words, 'We, the people of the United States,' instead of 'We, the states,' as it had been passed by the Committee of the Whole. Gouverneur Morris changed the wording to 'We, the people.' And if you look at the preamble, there's two entities mentioned there. 'We, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish,' blah, 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 'for the people of the United States of America.'" Two different groups there. So they call themselves "We, the people." Make this for you, the people. And they had no authorization to do that. But when we look at exactly what's happened in our history, and like I said, a lot of people get upset when I talk about their beloved parchment, the Constitution. And I would ask people a question, very simply. Would you tell me, and I'm open to hear, would you tell me any time that Constitution has ever protected the white people of the South? Tell me one time. Are they protecting our monuments? Did they protect Fort Benning? Did they protect Fort Bragg? Did they protect any of the things that belong to the people of the South? Or have they attacked them? Why should we support something like that? Well, that was three of the things I'm going to tell you, three of the organizations that I was most happy to belong to. The POW-MIA movement. And I'm going to tell you how that was shut down. It was shut down at the 1988 presidential convention in New Orleans, Louisiana, and it was shut down by the Republicans who shut down the POW movement. Now, don't forget that Ronald Reagan had said, running for office in 1980, what's happened to those POWs is my number one priority. He said that in a campaign speech. And then he put, who were the two senators he put in charge of POW activities in the government? John McCain and John Kerry. I sat in on some meetings when I was with the AFFA, POW-MIA. I sat in on some meetings. And one time it was just absolutely unreal when you would see a room, huge room full of family members, wives, daughters, sons, sometimes fathers, sometimes mothers, who were there because they wanted to find out what had happened to their loved ones. And if you would have seen the way that those people, especially 5 sisters, showed up from New Mexico, the Apodaca sisters. Now, they had different names at that time. They'd married, but their brother was an Air Force major. He had been shot down. Now, those of you who have been involved in the military knew that at one time we had to give those men in Vietnam special code numbers because the Vietnamese, when something would come in to rescue them, the Vietnamese were luring them in so they could shoot at it. So they had special designators, special codes. one of our satellites overflying found Major Apodaca's code stamped out in the elephant grass near a prisoner of war camp. And his 5 sisters were there. And one of them stood up and said, "What is being done about this?" And John McCain said, "There ain't none of them alive. I know there's none of them alive. I wouldn't have lasted this long, therefore nobody else could have." And the sisters broke down in tears. Well, there was a U.S. Air Force retired Special Forces colonel who was there because his son was a POW, Air Force lieutenant. When that meeting was over, Colonel Shelton met John McCain outside, grabbed him, slammed him up against the wall, and said, "If you ever make one of these women cry again, I'll kill you. I won't say what he said. Of course, then the colonel gets grabbed by Capitol Hill police. But this is, folks, we need, if we are going to win this war, Michael, we have to win it. We know that. If we're going to win this war, then we're going to have to know the truth. And we're going to have to, I ask people over and over again, they ask me, people will come up and I say, "Do you believe in secession?" "Oh, yes, that's our only answer." And I said, "Well, have you seceded?" And they go, I said, "You want to ask your state to do something you're not willing to do yourself? You're not willing to secede? Do you still vote?" "Oh, yes, that's my obligation." I'm sorry to contradict some of you folks, but no, it's not. Because there's never been an honest election in America. Because, what was it? Was it Stalin or Marx said, "I don't care who votes, just who counts the votes"? Okay, who protested that at the Constitutional Convention and said, "No, if we're going to have elections, then the people must be involved in counting the votes, not the authority"? A fellow named Luther Martin from Maryland, longest sitting state attorney in the history of this country, and most people have never heard of him, and you're not going to find him usually with a search, because if you put in Luther Martin, you'll get everything they want you to know about Martin Luther. I've seen it happen over and over again. And they said, if that old, I forgot who it was, but somebody said, if elections actually worked, they wouldn't let us have them. And I go back again to another man in history, a fellow by the name of Lysander Spooner. Maybe some of you have heard of him, maybe they haven't. He was a Yankee from Massachusetts. He was an abolitionist who said Abraham Lincoln was a fraud. He was no abolitionist because in the 1848 speeches, he was saying blacks will never be equal to the whites. We can't allow that to happen. 2 years later, like every other politician, he's changed his mind. Somebody had money enough to change his mind. And that's how it goes in D.C., I promise you. Who comes up with the most money, buys the most members of the party, and they rule. It doesn't make any difference who you put in there. But I'm sure all of you have heard, and I love this story when I heard him tell it in person, I'm sure all of you have heard of Ron Paul, right? Well, Ron Paul got ready to run for Congress in Texas back in the very beginning. He had a really good buddy in California by the name of Burt Blumert. God rest his soul. He was a silver and gold dealer. And so Ron calls him and he says, "Burt," he said, "I'm thinking about running for Congress." He said, "Would you support me?" And Burt Blumert said, "No, sorry, Ron, I couldn't do that to a friend." There are so many parts out there, people, there are so many things that we don't know and that we need to know. We do, and one of the things that really got to me, and I don't think most people are aware of this, I have two, well, I know you're not, I have 2 storage units, climate control storage units, full of documents that I have collected from the National Archives, Library of Congress, University of Virginia, University of South Carolina, University of Georgia. I'm a document idiot. I love them because that's where the truth is. You know, and it was always amazing to me until I actually got to the National Congress, Library of Congress, National Archives, and started seeing all of the letters that were written back and forth between the founders. There's where the story is. Because they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have email, they didn't even have smoke signals. How did they communicate? By letter. And when you read these letters and you see exactly what was going on, it's not anything like what you've been taught. Now, well, I know that we've talked about Patrick Henry, but Patrick Henry said that if we adopt this Constitution, there will be a bloody civil war. How did he know? He said it will happen within 100 years. Well, it happened 71 years later. And it was exactly as he said. At the end of the Civil War, Patrick Henry's great-grandson, his name was the Reverend Edward Fontaine. And he said the following: "The violent and bloody struggle has ensued, and it is not yet ended. The Constitution is destroyed. The government has been overturned, and the century has not yet rolled away. Our present government is not that which was framed in Philadelphia that did not last a century. The new dominion which has arisen out of it is changing continually. What it is now is difficult to define. It will require another Patrick Henry to predict." That was in his sermon. He got part of it wrong. He thought that the Constitution was a good thing. What did the Constitution do to stop Lincoln from his atrocities against the people of the South? Somebody tell me. I really want to know. What did the Constitution do to protect the people of the South during Reconstruction? Well, then good old Lysander Spooner was right. And then it just hit me the other day when he said this. Lysander Spooner wrote this in 1865. He said the Constitution was either responsible for what we have just experienced, or it was powerless to prevent it. Either way, it is worthless to exist. And if your Constitution can't stop a tyrant, why do you have it? If you had a car, had no gas, why would you keep it in the driveway? If it doesn't work, and I believe our biggest problem as Southerners is hanging on to that doggone Constitution and believing that there's a difference between a red politician and a blue politician. And one of the things I can tell you, and it was 40 years ago when I was in the bowels of this beast, but I'm going to tell you this right now. The international banking cabal owns every politician in Washington. I don't care who they are. They own them all. And the documentation for that is just too copious to be ignored. Now, it was called Patrick Henry's philosophy. But how many of you people think that the 10th Amendment protects the states? Nobody? Well, I better shut up. You guys already know. Do we have any rights in the Bill of Rights? Any of them? First, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th. Do we have any rights? The people, do we have any rights there? Somebody please tell me. Do we have a right to keep and bear arms? We better. At least I do. And my right to protect myself and my family came from God. It didn't come from government. Now, all of our rights came from God. They did not come from government. Government hasn't even done anything to protect them. As a matter of fact, it's busy taking them away. And I'm just going to throw something else in here. How many of you have ever heard of the Missouri Second Amendment Protection Act? Well, the people of Missouri got tired of this 2 or 3 years ago, and they said, we're darn tired of federal agents coming in and enforcing laws on the people of Missouri. We're tired of that. Something beeping. It's time for me to shut up. Anyway, they voted in a Second Amendment Protection Act which said that no federal law pertaining to the right to keep and bear arms would be enforced in the state of Missouri. They passed it. The governor signed it. They were all happy. 2 weeks later, they were sued by the Department of Justice. Now, imagine that. Why would the government sue a state who was trying to protect the rights of their people? But, you know, there's a funny thing about the DOJ. The DOJ sued them, but the DOJ got to name the judge. Fix is in. So who did they appoint to hear this case? Federal Judge Brian Weems. He was appointed to the bench by Obama. And he rules against the people of Missouri, and he says the people have no rights that aren't subject to the Supremacy Clause. Article 6, Clause 2. The clause that Luther Martin fought against so hard at the convention, it's unreal. You got to read it. I love that man. You want to talk about passion for what's right? Now, he was known to be a man at the bottle. He was known for that. And one of the classics of American history, one of the guys probably most of you have never even thought of, but to me it's one of the guys who did more to destroy this country than anything else. And he got to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What, Mark? Huh? John Marshall. And it's kind of funny how John Marshall got to be Chief Justice, because John Adams and his crazy Alien and Sedition Act had just lost the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. Now, how many of you know that there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and it went to the Congress 36 times for a vote before Jefferson was finally selected? Now, there's lots of words out there, if you look in the National Archives, about corruption about that. Allegedly, Jefferson went to one member of Congress and said, look, I'll give you a position in my cabinet if you just won't vote the next time this comes up. And he didn't vote. So it went for Jefferson. Well, we look at Luther Martin and we go back to John Marshall, 1819, McCulloch v. Maryland. The Bank of the United States had opened a branch in Maryland. And Luther Martin said, well, if you're going to do business in Maryland, you're going to pay your taxes. And so the federal government said, no, we're not. We're not paying taxes. And so Luther Martin sent armed people down to the U.S. Bank office, and they seized the money that was owed to them, left them the rest of it, but sued them the money. Well, the bank took them to court. McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819. And of course, Luther Martin was standing up for the people of Maryland. So at the trial, John Marshall makes a classic comment which I never hear anybody use anymore. But he said the power to tax is the power to destroy. If you can tax the bank, you can destroy it. What about us? Isn't that the same concept? The exact same concept, but John Adams, after he lost the election, Thomas Jefferson had already said and had already talked to Spencer Roane about being the next Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice. Now, does anybody know who Patrick Roane was? Who Roane was? Patrick Henry's son-in-law. Spencer married Patrick Henry's oldest daughter. And folks, if you haven't read about Spencer Roane, read about Spencer Roane. That man knew what freedom was. And I've always thought, one of those things in history, you always say, what if? What if Spencer Roane, if Jefferson would have gotten in and put Spencer Roane in, instead of Marshall being put in, who Marshall was John Adams' Secretary of State. So he takes him from Secretary of State and he puts him into Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Well, 1803 comes along and we've got Marbury v. Madison. Right? You folks familiar with that? Okay. So anyway, Marbury v. Madison comes up, and of course, that is where John Marshall said the right of the Congress or the government to rule on everything it does. So a Supreme Court decision gave the power to do anything they wanted to do. And so the thing of it was, though, that wasn't the part of the case. The case was brought by Marbury, who had been appointed a judge, but John Marshall left office so quick he didn't give him his appointment. So Marbury's suing to get his appointment as a judge. And guess what? He doesn't get it, but Marshall uses that decision but the person who didn't deliver his appointment to him was John Marshall. He should have recused himself. He shouldn't have been involved in that case at all. But he did. But at the Marbury v. Madison, 1819, jumping back and forth, John Marshall gives Luther Martin a lecture on what happened at the Constitutional Convention. He says, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. You need to know that, counselor. Luther Martin says, with all due respect, Mr. Chief Justice, I was there. You weren't. Talk about getting your legs chopped out from under you. That to me was just, but if you look at the 10th Amendment, and most of us know that, at least we were taught that. It gave the states the authority, all the other stuff. But if we look at the 10th Amendment, is there a phrase there that shouldn't be there? Where it says, these are granted to the states or to the people? Well, there was this guy named Richard Henry Lee, related to that man, who saw through it. And he said, remove that phrase. Or to the people. Remove that phrase. Because without it, we have the meaning that we want. And of course, the Federalists outnumbered the Anti-Federalists in the first U.S. Senate 20-2. The only two Anti-Federalists there were both from Virginia. One was Richard Henry Lee, one was William Grayson, both very close friends of Patrick Henry, who was the governor. Now, people, we need to develop the integrity of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was governor of the state of Virginia when the government first started under George Washington, 1789. He was the governor. The people of Virginia wanted Patrick Henry to be one of their first senators. He turned it down. Why? Because he said, I cannot take an oath to that document that outlawed the Christian faith. Where is that integrity today? Do you think anybody around here would turn down a chance to be a U.S. Senator just because they had to take an oath to a constitution that did away with the Christian faith in the state constitutions? And then for the piece de la resistance, as they call it, George Washington offered Patrick Henry a seat on the Supreme Court. He turned that down and told Washington the same thing. I have a copy of the letter in my storage. He was very honorable to Washington, very polite, everything else. But sir, with good conscience, I cannot accept that position because I cannot take your oath. Now, people, in my mind, I look back at that and I look at my grandfather and I look at his, as that old saying he said, you can't be a little bit Confederate, you either is or you ain't. And so when we look at that today and we look at that kind of character and we look at Patrick Henry and I think about the two, folks, we Southerners are not going to survive and pass it on to our own heritage if we don't accept those principles. If we don't become 100% Confederate. And now to tell you folks a little bit about my programs, or if anybody has any questions. I'm not sure if you do a Q&A or not, Mike. But anyway, I have a radio show every Saturday on Republic Broadcasting Network called The Rebel Madman. Now tomorrow, I'll be doing that show from the kitchen. So, what are you doing here?
I heard that, so I came. I heard you were up at 11, so I got at 4:30 to be here, so I wouldn't miss this.
James and I have known each other a long time. A long time. He's not near as pretty as me, but we've known each other a long time. But we're both bald-headed, so we're heading in the right direction, right, buddy? But on Sunday evenings is the program I had the gentleman on this past Sunday, and it's called The Rebel and the Renegade Roundtable. That's Sunday afternoons. And that would be, Central Time, that would be 5 to 6. That's right. I'm not picking, buddy. That would be 5 to 6. And my program tomorrow will be from 3 to 6, 4 to 7 Eastern. I also have a Substack. Now, my grandfather handicapped me in another way. Really not a handicap, it was a blessing. He told me just a couple of days before he died. He said, boy, the good Lord has given you a blessing. You have a fantastic memory. Isn't that why NSA wanted you? And I said, I imagine. He said, let me tell you something. Knowledge not shared is knowledge lost. And he said, now I want you to spread the truth. You're not going to make any friends. He said, except you'll make a few, and those are the ones that count. And so he left me with that imperative, and so that's what I've been trying to do. My wife's a retired school teacher. She's asked me, I don't know how many times, why don't you shut up and come home and be quiet? And I said, well, if I came home, I don't shut up, and I ain't quiet there either. But she is a math professor. And she is constantly telling me in a very joking fashion, I know she will go into prime numbers and all this other stuff, and she'll talk about that, and she'll say, and your head is full of useless knowledge. That's our joke. She's very much supportive of what I do, very supportive, but that's kind of our joke. But the one thing I found out is in homeschooling my grandkids, I do the history, she does the math, thank goodness. But I got our grandson in trouble in the public school. He would sit down, he'll ask me historical questions. He's in the 5th grade now. And he asked me one time, he said, Pops, he said, our teacher said that all of the founders were slave owners. Is that true? And I said, no. And he said, well, who wasn't? And I said, Luther Martin. So the next day, he's back in school and he challenges his teacher. Uh-oh. He challenges his teacher and says, have you ever heard of Luther Martin? And she goes, no, you mean Martin Luther? He says, no, Luther Martin. And she says, no such person, forget it. That's fake history. He told my daughter and our son-in-law that the next day. He's been homeschooled ever since. And folks, here's something. I gave a presentation in June to the Turner Ashby SCV group in Winchester, Virginia. Wonderful group of people, a lot of real Confederates there. And I'm working with 3 of them at the present time to create a homeschool history program to where we could make it available. One of the ladies that's heavily involved, she's in the, what's the ladies' version? The UDC. Thank you, Mark. I need to borrow you for my brain. But that is something we're working on. But at my Substack is where I intend, good Lord allows me the time, to put every document I have on that website. Now that's going to take some time, and I'm working at it. I also have podcasts on there where I talk about Southern history. Currently, there's 37 podcasts on there. They're usually about 1 hour each. And the titles of my podcasts are called Whistlin' Dixie. Wonder where I ever got that from. But that is what I try to do. That is what I want to do to try to put these forward. I see it's almost noon, time to eat, time for me to shut up, right? But folks, I really appreciate your attention. But if anyone has any questions, ask me before the food's served, because I don't talk and eat at the same time. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What happened to the distinction between the Missouri gun thing and the DOJ?
Well, I'm sorry, I should have finished that. Brian Weems said it was unconstitutional, that all rights were subject to the Supremacy Clause, so it was done away with. The people of the state of Missouri appealed the decision to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear it. But one of those wonderful justices wrote a paper defending the judge's position. And I wonder what that wonderful judge's name was. Neil Gorsuch. You know, one of those great Republicans. People, I'm going to finish it with this. I have been involved in 3 major movements in my life. I'm very proud of all of them. I was involved with the POW-MIA program. Then I became a working member of the Minuteman Project. That's how I got to meet this guy back here. And then 2009, I got involved in the Tea Party movement. Is there an entity that you can think of that shut down all 3 of those movements? The Republican Party. Now, why would the good old Republicans do that? Are you people familiar with the origin of the Republican Party? It was formed in Ripon, Wisconsin in, what was that, 1856? And there were 19 delegates at the Republican Party convention, all who were card-carrying communists. The party of Lincoln? Are you kidding me? Now, I know some folks, and I will shut up with this. I know there's some folks that really like Donald Trump. That's your prerogative. I'm not going to tell you not to like him. But I got to tell you this, when he stood in that church in Detroit, Michigan in 2016 and said, my proudest moment of my life is being elected the nominee of the party of Abraham Lincoln, and I intend to bring the principles of Abraham Lincoln back to this country. It's documented. He's also a guy who said, take the guns first, due process second. Okay, that sounds like a good guy to me. But anyway, not to further incite anyone, I just wanted to work on the truth. But can't think, Mark? Yes, sir.
Just one interesting comment about Lincoln and the Republicans and communists. When there still was a communist party in the U.S. and they had their conventions every year, they always had a big effigy of Lincoln behind the podium.
I got pictures.
Every time they met, they had an effigy of Lincoln.
I got pictures, yeah.
And the only reason they disbanded and quit running people for office is because they said the other two parties have adopted all the planks of communism already, so what's the point?
Are you familiar with the book that the Communist Party wrote called, what is it, the Continuing the Revolution? Got a picture of Lincoln and Marx on the front page? I'm sorry, folks, but I can't participate in that. It's just not in me. But Mike, thank you so much for allowing me to be here.